also Dirk and Marius for the opportunity to share some of the important knowledge that we've gained over the past couple of years. Increasingly in recent years, we have found clients coming to us saying that they no longer find singular demographics sufficient to understand what is fueling either the demand or the slowdown in their shopping centres or individual retailers. And we have found that in the market there are quite powerful yet largely unseen forces at play in these shopping centre environments. Forces that continue to affect individual centres as well as retailers across South Africa as global leader. In that context, the question, South Africa as global leader, defining these so-called power trends, the trends that continue to shape not only the retail but other real estate environments in South Africa. A quick look at a reference framework to contextualize why these power trends are so extremely powerful. And then we'll move into the power trends. We've identified 5 for purposes of the discussion today, and then some implications for the retail landscape, looking at anecdotes, case studies, and very practical examples of how these trends continue to shape the retail environment in the country. As far as the question is concerned, is South Africa a global leader? Most certainly, if we look at the latest statistics released by SACSC IPD, South Africa topped the list for the better part of the previous decade. 8 years in total, we were atop of the world list of property markets as far as total property returns are concerned. Slumped a couple of places during the recession, and since the end of 2012, we have regained that first position. So undoubtedly, South Africa, and specifically our real estate markets, can be regarded as global leaders. What then are these powerful so-called trends that continue to shape the environment of the shopping centres, our housing markets, and so forth? Power trends are inherently structural in nature, and it's therefore quite often difficult to pick up in short-term cyclical data. In other words, purely looking at a demographic where you have, let's say, 10 people in the market, tomorrow there's 11, there's growth of 11%, but still there's a very powerful undercurrent in addition to just a singular dimensional demographic that influences the performance of specific real estate assets. These power trends are cross-cutting. In other words, they're evident in more than one sector, and because of that, they hold fundamental, broad-based implications, not only for retail, but for real estate markets across South Africa. In short, these power trends are game changers. So what are these power trends? Firstly, and I'll take you through the 5 before we get into each one of these in more detail. Power trend number 1, commodities and the mining value chain. Power trend number 2, government initiatives and policy directives. Power trend number 3, urbanization. Power trend number 4, the social grant system. Many a shopping centre owner in second economy areas have confronted us with questions regarding the impact of the social grant system on their shopping centres. Power trend number 5, incredibly interesting, the so-called shadow economy and its impact on the South African economy at large. Why exactly are these power trends so powerful? And that I'd like to explain in terms of a very basic economic equation for those of you that have had Economics 101. For those of you that haven't, you needn't fear, we'll keep it simple. In essence, what you see, the y plus c plus I plus x minus z, is the most basic economic equation that explains what's happening around us in reality. And the reason these trends are so powerful is because they touch on every single aspect of that equation. They touch on C, which is the private consumption expenditure side of the economy. They touch on I, which is the investment side, on G, which is government expenditure, and on X and Z, which are the imports and exports from a particular geographic region. In short, if we were to summarize those in terms of 2 broad categories, the consumption drivers include the conventional demographics, population, income indicators, those that we're quite accustomed to in most demographic studies, but it also includes macro migration patterns, and even more significant, the infusions of private equity, the so-called shadow economy, and broad diaspora that continues to influence South Africa and other African countries. The second category, economic drivers, including government projects and policies, and the very powerful effect of grants. Moving then on to the first powertrain, commodities and the mining value chain. We see in South Africa there's a very specific footprint dictated by our rich endowment of natural resources. Essentially, we are a commodities-driven economy, and the spatial footprint of these resources, coupled with the movement of these resources, as well as the ultimate ports and processing zones, continue to exert very powerful influences on the spatial pattern of economic development in the country, hence also current and future demand for various types of real estate markets. Government has essentially captured these trends in numerous policy documents. One of these, and I'll deal with that in more detail in the Powertrain 2, the so-called IPAP, or Industrial Policy Action Plan. In these government policies, specific regions with key focus areas have been identified, linking them to corridors with a distinct export focus. For instance, the link between Gauteng, where 40% of the South African economy is concentrated, towards Richards Bay. Increasing growth on the northern coast of KZN. Richards Bay accounts for approximately 80% of all exports from Southern Africa. So very powerful spatial trends emerging from these patterns. What we have done in addition to that is map the economic footprint of the country. And what you see on this particular slide, all the darker shaded areas are areas that are growing in excess of the national economic growth rate. The intermediate shades are areas which are growing at or around the national average, and the lighter shades are areas that are growing below the national average. So clearly, recurring themes as far as spatial drivers are concerned. Up north in Limpopo, around the Burgers Fort, Gauteng corridor, the northern coastal areas of KZN, the northern coastal areas of the Eastern Cape, the areas around the ports of Kuga, as well as Nelson Mandela Bay, and to a lesser extent, the Western Cape. So what is the significance of retail in this context? We have found in the data, looking at, for instance, standard indicators, that retail has been a major driver of economic activity in the recent decade, and in particular since 2000, and also as far as South Africa's recovery, 2010, 11, and 12 up to date is concerned. Powertrain number 2, government initiatives. There are a couple of recurring themes in documents like the National Spatial Development Perspective, the National Development Plan, National Growth Path, Industrial Policy Action Plans. These recurring themes include manufacturing and the continued beneficiation of products, downstream beneficiation, mining and tourism, the effects of retail specifically, other private sector-based services, tourism, are recurring themes throughout these various policy documents. To sum them up, manufacturing and the manufacturing, the value-adding chain of these commodities, the enabling economic infrastructure, and the tertiary sector, including retail, services, and tourism. Very powerful drivers that have been identified by government. In addition to that, government has formulated so-called strategic infrastructure projects, 18 in total. Most of these have a very specific geographic focus. To take you through two examples, SIP1 and SIP2, you may have heard of these. SIP1 is the so-called Northern Mineral Belt. Now, essentially, it may appear to the lay to be focused largely on the mineral resources of Limpopo. However, what is also quite significant is the linkages that are being created between SIP1 through Limpopo and Mpumalanga to the port in KZN of Richards Bay. So there's a very specific geographic pattern of influences that is emerging as a consequence of each one of these SIPs being implemented. Government has put out tenders, so most of these SIPs are currently in the planning phase. SIP2, the Durban Free State Gauteng Logistics Corridor, equally significant, building on economic opportunities between the import-based port of Durban and the corridor, the N3 corridor between the port and Gauteng. In addition to that, we have the all-important industrial development zones. Most of these industrial development zones, Kuga, East London, Richards Bay, Oliver Tambo, not yet active. In Saldanha Bay, they've completed pre-feasibilities and feasibilities. Most of those are in the process of being converted to so-called SEZs, or Spatial Economic Zones, In geographic context, we're looking at 10 in total, stretching from areas in all parts of the country, essentially, from Dubai Trade Port in KZN, in Kumazi, the eastern extremities of Mpumalanga, the agro-processing and logistics hub, Harry Smith, right through the Free State to ICT hub at Nasrec, and solar efficiency and related renewable projects in the Northern and Western Cape. Power trend number 3, urbanization. I'm sure you may have seen graphs to this effect, 2001 census data, 2011 census data. On average, it gives you annual growth of 1.45%. But how much do we actually know about the structural composition of South Africa's growth? Quite interestingly, if we look at the long-term trend, this is consistent with global growth trends. Our population as well as household growth is distinctly slowing down. Coupled with that, and the trend is masked by 2 specific phenomena. The first one is rural-urban immigration, and the second, this is quite often felt in urban environments, the second is the social grant system, which tends to skew the income profile, especially in second economy and deep rural areas. What this pattern illustrates is the significant movement of people between rural areas, the dominant hub of Gauteng, eThekwini, the Eastern Cape, the ports of Nelson Mandela Bay, and the Western Cape, and also the influence to a larger extent of mining regions, Burgers Fort, the Sishen area, and other mining regions of the Northern Cape. So in short, what are we seeing? 60% of the South African population is currently urbanized. The expectation is that by 2030, we will be 70% urbanized, which means that roughly 85% people are attracted. 85% of people, or rather people, are increasingly moving to the regions where 85% of our economic activity is concentrated. And those areas constitute a mere 7% of South Africa's land mass. The expectation, therefore, is that we will continue to see, especially as far as our metropolitan regions are concerned, high rates of immigration over the next 3 to 4 decades, after which growth is expected to taper in most of these metropolitan regions. In short, the expectation is that between 2011 and 2041, that's a period of 3 decades, the South African population is estimated to increase by roughly 21 million, from the current 51 to around 72 million, which means that we can expect an additional 16 to 18 million people to move into our major metropolitan regions and cities. That equates to 500 to 600,000 people per annum. Significant opportunities in various real estate markets will be created. The social grant system has seen significant growth since its implementation around 2001, 2002. Just looking at this particular data set, averaging around 14% average compound annual growth since the inception of social grants. Very specific geographic focus. We see the dominant provinces that continue to benefit being the Free State at around 17%, Gauteng 15%, and also KZN around 15%. The long-term trend continues to worry to a certain extent because of its largely unsustainable nature. Even though the growth has decelerated to around 6.6%, that growth still exceeds population growth. It exceeds the rate at which our tax base is growing, it exceeds economic growth, and importantly, it also exceeds inflation. A cross-section of studies that we've conducted in second economy areas have subsequently shown the main sources of income, 36%, the traditional sources of salaries and wages. In addition to that, people generate substantial income, as you'll see from an anecdotal case study that I'll shortly show to you. Additional income through informal business enterprises, around 25%, the effects of grants, another 19-20%, and remittances, a very powerful trend, people working in the urban areas, taking money back home. It is just during the latest school holidays that we drove through one of these deep rural areas, and it's not uncommon, and probably some of you have already noted that, where you would see an S-Class Mercedes parked next to a rural hut in a deep rural area. How sustainable is this trend? We've seen Developers, to a large extent, base significant investments purely on the sum total of income and the expected future growth in a particular area, with a complete disregard for how these sources of income are ultimately comprised and the sustainability of the various sources. In addition to that so-called broad diaspora, it's estimated that around 66 billion per annum is sent back to Africa by immigrants abroad. This is a 2014 estimate, constituting around 5% of gross national income. In addition to that, Gauteng in particular, over the past decade, 2003 to 2013, has gained $800 million or dollar-based millionaires from the likes of Ghana, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Nigeria. So as we continue to see vast opportunities emerge in these African countries, Angola, generally referred to as South Africa's China, we continue to see the dominance of South Africa in an African context. And it holds quite important implications for various markets: retail, the housing market, the healthcare market, traveling, tourism, recreation, etc. It brings us to the shadow economy. Now, what is the shadow economy? It entails all economic activity informal, and many would be lured into saying that it is unorganized or disorganized, where in fact our research has shown that it is a highly organized subsector of the economy. It includes activities licit as well as illicit, which makes it extremely difficult to monitor and record, and also to regulate, and as a consequence of the above, it is largely untaxed. This, in short, is a vastly misunderstood concept. To give you an example, case study, Joe, alias, he's a butcher in a prominent township in Gauteng. We originally approached Joe and numerous other informal traders through a questionnaire, asking simple questions. Would he be prepared to pay 100 rands a month for a demarcated sidewalk area, for instance? And it built up 150 for an area with lockup facilities, 250 rands a month for a lockup facility with cold storage. And the response rate was extremely poor. So we had to change our strategy, change the entire survey methodology, and we approached Joe together with some of his other colleagues in the market on an informal basis. One of our professionals engaged Joe in the format of a discussion and inquired, and through this discussion we learned a number of very, very interesting things. Joe buys on a weekly basis meat from the market in City Deep. Sheep's head, for instance, he buys in bulk at a certain rate, dismantles it and sells it at a higher price. Buys it for 15 rands, for instance, per sheep's head. Dismantle, he would sell the eyes for a certain price, he would sell the tongue for a certain price, and it carries on. And through this investigation, we calculated that Joe turns around 52,000 rands per month. His input costs are around 38% of that. He has no paperwork, no admin, he pays no rent, no utilities, and he sees absolutely no need to formalize his business. Furthermore, in the latest census, he indicated to us that he had indicated to the census field worker that he was unemployed, but possibly looking for a job if the right one came around. Now, Joe, together with his family, settled in Diepsloot around 2002, where we received a free government subsidy house. They didn't end up selling the house. Instead, they densified, like most of their neighbors. And this is what Diepsloot looks like today. On average, every single household has built on 6 additional rental units. Each of these rental units generating a rental income, largely to foreigners, no questions asked, of around 500 to 750 rands per month. So in total, if you were to reconstruct Joe's regular monthly household income statement, it would look something like this. He typically nets around 32,000 from his business. Input costs deducted. He has an add-on service of prepared meals, a further 7,800. Income from his wife's piece jobs, and she also runs the rental scheme of around 3.5. And that's also the income they disclosed on their census form. The rental income from their 6 rental units, a further 3,700. 2 childcare grants and an old age grant. In total, just over 49,000 rands per month for this particular household. Now, clearly, we can't regard this as the norm in second economy areas, but it is not the exception to the rule either. There's a very, very powerful trend in these second economy areas that most of the statistical databases that we rely on aren't capturing. Implications for the retail landscape. Just to recap, we've seen decelerating population growth. There's high rates of immigration into certain geographic areas, pockets of high growth, significant infusions of private equity, remittances, broad diaspora, thriving and vastly underestimated nature, largely untaxed of the shadow economy, and decelerating population growth in certain rural areas, which is masked by the effect of social grants. There are various techniques that could be applied to interpret the landscape. Per capita based techniques, for instance. In total, we're sitting at just over 20 million square meters of retail floor space in the country. There's the provincial distribution. Many international geographers use a benchmark, a rule of thumb of 2 square meters per capita. So clearly, if you were to analyze this closely on a more fine-grained geographic basis, South Africa still has a lot to gain as far as real estate assets are concerned, especially over the next 3 to 4 decades. We've seen increases in the number of regionals between 2002 to 2013. Regional shopping centres from 14 to 44, increase of 30. Super regionals by 1, from 7 to 8. In addition to the first economy areas, and I'll get into the last couple of slides in the presentation, the significance of rural areas and the important contribution by these rural areas made to GDP. This is essentially a GDP map, in other words, the spatial distribution of economic activity in the country. We've seen, especially over the past 5 years, approximately 500,000 square meters of shopping centre floor space added specifically as far as second economy shopping centres are concerned. That's roughly 40% of the total of new construction that has taken place in the market. So, bringing us to our last case study, and this is a classic example of a deep rural shopping centre that we've analysed on face value, looking at the rate at which the market is growing. Spend in this particular market is growing at quite a decent rate, apparently. Trading density is growing at a real rate of around 3%. So on face value, everything looks to be in order. However, if you're familiar with the basic essentials of retail demand modelling, you'll know that retail potential is essentially inversely correlated between total sales or total spend in an area and the trading density. And that yields a curve with a slightly downward trend. And what this means is, in this particular geographic market, deep rural market, we're looking at a decelerating or a receding long-term demand base. That's not an immediate threat. It's not something that's bound to affect this particular centre over the next 5 years, perhaps even 10 years. But over the next 2 to 3 decades, this trend is bound to have a profound impact on this particular shopping centre and also on the way in which the owners manage the particular centre. I seem to have lost the image. Yeah.
Do you need that last?
Yeah, there's 2 slides left. All right, so just to recap on these figures, there's the calculation, and it essentially shows the inverse correlation. And we've developed a quadrant model that plots the shopping centre based on, respectively, the characteristics of the external market, receding market versus an expanding market. In this particular instance, this developer continues to blissfully record positive growth in this particular shopping centre. But what is clear is that we're sitting in a shopping centre with a slightly receding market over the long term. So in summary, South Africa reflects the characteristics of a typical developing economy with high rates of urban in-migration coupled with decelerating growth in certain rural areas. We've seen the beneficial impacts of the grant system, which in all probability cannot be sustained infinitely, but coupled with that is not to be discontinued in the foreseeable future. The impact of remittances, quite powerful and quite often understated in census data, coupled with the effects of the so-called shadow economy, vastly understated, and it probably calls for an entire revisit of our tax regime and how it's currently structured to target the formal market.